Imagine the scene in Coventry. The streets of an 11th century English town, normally bustling with the noise of the market, are eerily silent. Every door is barred, every window shuttered. The town holds its collective breath. Through these empty lanes rides a lone figure on horseback, a noble woman, her face a mask of determined resolve, her only covering the curtain of her own long hair. This lady's husband has agreed to lower the taxes for the town on the condition that she engage in this bizarre act, and all the townspeople have agreed to avert their gaze. This is the image of Lady Godiva, a picture of profound sacrifice, a woman willing to endure the ultimate public humiliation to save her people from the crushing weight of her husband's taxes. The story has been repeated as fact now for almost 1,000 years, but historians question whether the tale of Lady Godiva's ride has any truth to it whatsoever. The first step in separating fact from fiction is to get her name right. The woman we know as Lady Godiva was, in her own time, called God-Gifu. It's an Old English name meaning God's gift, and the name Godiva is simply a later, Latinized version that stuck. God-Gifu lived through one of the most violent and unstable periods in English history. Born in the 900s, her life spanned the reigns of no fewer than 9 different kings. She lived through the reign of Ethelred the Unready, through the Danish conquest, and all the way to the Norman conquest of 1066. She was a witness to the death of Anglo-Saxon England and the birth of a new Norman dynasty. God-Gifu wasn't just a bystander to these events. She was at the very heart of English power. She was married to Leofric, the Earl of Mercia, who was one of the 3 most powerful and influential men in the entire kingdom. Leofric was a formidable political figure, a kingmaker who was instrumental in securing the throne for Harold Harefoot after Canute's death in 1035. Together, God-Gifu and Leofric were a true power couple, controlling immense wealth and territory. Their family was a dynasty in its own right. Their son, Elfgar, inherited the earldom, and their granddaughter, Eldgith, would go on to marry King Harold Godwinson. This would make their granddaughter the last Anglo-Saxon Queen of England. Here, we encounter the first major collision between the legend and the historical record. The story of the ride depends entirely on the idea that Godiva was a virtuous, but ultimately powerless woman, able only to plead with her husband to show mercy. The real God-Gifu was anything but powerless, and unlike in later centuries under Norman rule, Anglo-Saxon law afforded women significant legal and economic rights. Crucially, they could inherit, purchase, and own property entirely independently of their husbands. God-Gifu was one of the wealthiest landowners of her era, amongst both men and women. She held vast estates in her own right across the heart of Mercia, in regions like Leicestershire, Warwickshire, and Shropshire. The most definitive proof of her status comes from the Domesday Book. This massive survey, compiled by William the Conqueror in 1086, was designed to record exactly who owned what in his new kingdom. The survey was conducted after God-Gifu's death, yet it still lists her extensive pre-conquest land holdings. Remarkably, it identifies her as one of the only Anglo-Saxons, and the only Anglo-Saxon woman, to have remained a major landholder after the Norman invasion. This is a stunning testament to her influence and power, a status so immense that even the new Norman regime had to formally acknowledge it. But the most critical fact of all is that the small but growing settlement of Coventry was one of God-Gifu's personal estates. It belonged to her directly, not to her husband Leofric. This historical reality presents a fundamental challenge to the legend. The story of the ride was first written down in the 13th century, nearly 200 years after God-Gifu lived. By that time, The more patriarchal legal system of the Normans was firmly in place, which tied land ownership to military service and heavily favored male inheritance. A 13th century monk would have viewed the world through this lens, naturally assuming that the earl, as the man, held ultimate authority over all lands and taxes within his domain. The legend he recorded, therefore, isn't just a fanciful tale. It's an anachronism. It projects the legal assumptions of the Norman world back onto an Anglo-Saxon past where a woman wielding independent power to that level had become almost unthinkable. So, if God Gifu was such a prominent figure, why is there no mention of her famous ride in any document from her own time? This is perhaps the single most compelling piece of evidence against the story's historicity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a detailed year-by-year account of events in England, is silent on the matter. No contemporary records of any kind refer to this extraordinary and scandalous event involving one of the realm's most important noblewomen. For nearly 200 years after her death, God Gifu was remembered as a pious benefactor of churches, along with her husband. The story of the ride appears for the first time, seemingly out of nowhere, around the year 1235. It was recorded in a Latin chronicle called the Flores Historiarum, or Flowers of History, compiled by a monk named Roger of Wendover at St. Albans Abbey. Wendover and his successor, Matthew Paris, were known for being enthusiastic collectors of folklore. Interestingly, Wendover's original version is quite different from the one we know today. In his telling, God Gifu does ride through the marketplace covered only by her long hair. However, she's not alone, but rather attended by two knights, also traveling on horseback, who shielded her from view. Over the following centuries, the story was retold and refined, with each generation adding new layers that heightened the drama and moral clarity. First, the two knights who accompanied her were quietly dropped from the narrative, leaving Godiva to ride completely alone and amplifying her courage and personal risk. Later, the detail was added that Godiva herself had ordered the townspeople to stay inside and not look, transforming the story into one of mutual respect between the lady and her people. The most famous addition to the story, however, came much later and would be one of the standout features of the legend. The character of Peeping Tom, which is where that phrase comes from, was added in the 16th century. Peeping Tom agreed not to look, along with all the other townspeople, but he was rendered blind as divine punishment for sneaking a peek. It changed the story from simply a tale of economic injustice to a morality narrative about the consequences of disrespect. When we place the fully formed legend alongside the historical facts, the entire narrative structure begins to collapse. The story is riddled with inconsistencies and anachronisms that make it historically implausible. First, there's the problem of the place. The legend is set in Coventry's bustling marketplace. But in the mid-11th century, Coventry was a tiny settlement, little more than a village with a population of a few hundred people centered around the monastery. It simply wouldn't have had a large public marketplace for such a dramatic ride. The chroniclers were describing the Coventry of their own time when it did have a large marketplace to ride through. Second, and most importantly, is the problem of power. As we've seen, God Gifu personally owned the estate of Coventry. Under Anglo-Saxon law, if a local toll was oppressing the residents, she possessed the legal authority to reduce or abolish it herself. The central conflict of the legend, a wife pleading with her husband, is based on a complete misunderstanding of her actual power. Simply put, God Gifu was the one who held all the cards in Coventry, not Leofric. And while he certainly could have influenced her, this was her holding, not his. This is, of course, working under the assumption that this was a tax which the Earl was entitled to levy personally. Third is the problem of the tax itself. Some accounts suggest the levy in question was the Heergeld, or army tax. This wasn't a local toll invented by a greedy earl. It was a national land tax levied by the king to pay for the defense of the entire realm against Viking invasion. As a royal tax, Earl Leofric's role was simply to collect it. He had no authority to cancel it for a single village. An appeal would have had to go directly to the king, making God-Gifu's protest to her husband pointless. Finally, there is the problem of Leofric's character. The legend requires him to be a cruel ruler of his domain, yet historical sources paint a picture of a shrewd and respected statesman whose marriage to God-Gifu was a partnership, evidenced by their many joint religious foundations. Finally, there's the problem of what he has her do. Anglo-Saxon England was heavily based upon honor, and having a wife who engaged in salacious and scandalous activities would be seen as a mark upon Earl Leofric's character. By forcing his wife of all people to ride through Coventry in such a state, by the logic of his own time, he was in essence engaging in a self-humiliation ritual on a grand scale. If the ride never happened, historians have tried to understand how such a strangely specific story came to be. One theory is that it was simply just made up by the chroniclers, and they grafted on a popular and well-known historical figure to make it more interesting. Under this theory, essentially they did the medieval equivalent of adding a popular public domain character like Dracula to a video game or movie. However, the most plausible theory suggests the legend is a dramatic misinterpretation of a common act of Christian penance. In Anglo-Saxon England, individuals who had committed serious sins could be assigned a public penance. A central element of this ritual was humility. A high-status penitent would be required to appear in public stripped of all signs of their rank. They would walk barefoot, dressed only in simple plain clothes, without any jewelry or other markers of their nobility. For a powerful countess like God-Gifu, being seen in public without her finery would have been a profound act of humility. Under this theory, God-Gifu, who was a highly religious person, even by the standards of the time, may have participated in such an act of penitence. This act was then misinterpreted through a game of intergenerational telephone when Roger of Wendover came into contact with the story. From there it was embellished and reframed. In the final analysis, the historical consensus is fairly clear that the ride of Lady Godiva almost certainly never happened. Even though it contains no overtly fantastical elements, it's almost certainly just as much of a legend as a tale of a knight confronting a dragon. The historical God-Gifu was a real person. She was a powerful, pious, and influential Anglo-Saxon noblewoman who left her mark on the historical record through her wealth and her faith. Lady Godiva, the legendary figure, is an icon of compassion, courage, and economic justice, and while she's based on her, the historical God-Gifu and the figure of Lady Godiva are separate. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy just reminding you to click the like button and subscribe if you've learned something so far in this video. Also, don't forget to check out my podcast, Lazy Chill True Crime, if you're in the mood for something completely different. The link to the podcast is in the description. Now with all that said, let's get back to business. In 1786, an unknown sailor would be slain in a manner so brutal that the story is still remembered till this day. Our story begins on September 24th in that same year at the Red Lion Inn in the village of Thursley in England. An unknown sailor, whose name has been lost to history, was returning to duty, heading on foot back to his ship docked at Portsmouth. Inside the cozy tavern, he met three sailors, James Marshall, Michael Casey, and Edward Lonegone. By all accounts, these men seemed friendly enough. The unknown sailor, described later as generous but unfortunate, welcomed their company and paid for rounds of drinks and a hot meal for the group. Such kindness wasn't unusual among wayfarers bonding over a pint, and perhaps the lonely traveler felt safer in numbers for the long road ahead. What he didn't know was that Marshall, Casey, and Lone Gun were already sizing him up as prey. When the stranger pulled out a gold coin to settle the bill, it likely kindled disturbing ideas in the others' minds. The sailors left the Red Lion together at dusk, ostensibly to continue south toward Hindhead, a village located not too far away. Tragically, the friendly stranger had unwittingly thrown in his lot with 3 men who saw his kindness as weakness and his very modest wealth as an opportunity. A couple of miles beyond Thursley, the narrow road wound into the high, desolate terrain of Hindhead Hill. At some lonely stretch outside the village, Marshall, Casey, and Lone Gun sprang their trap. Under the cover of darkness, they ambushed their charitable fellow traveler. Later reports describe a ferocious attack, with the sailor almost beheaded in the assault. The 3 assailants stripped the victim of his clothes and possessions, presumably to rob him of anything of value. They dragged his limp, bloodied body off the road and rolled it down into a deep, brush-filled valley, locally known by the eerie name of the Devil's Punch Bowl. Believing they had concealed the evidence of their heinous deed, the perpetrator hurriedly fled the scene with the sailors' clothes bundled under their arms. What the 3 men didn't realize was that their crime had not gone entirely unwitnessed. By sheer chance, there were eyewitnesses nearby on that hillside. 2 local men crossing nearby glimpsed figures dumping what looked like a bundle or body down the slope. Fearful of confronting 3 desperate characters in the dark, these witnesses kept their distance until the trio moved on. Only then did they venture closer and make the gruesome discovery. Horrified, the locals raced back down the road to raise the alarm at the nearest inn. The alarm was first sounded back at the Red Lion in Thursley. Without delay, an impromptu posse of townsfolk formed to find the 3 men. Despite their rudimentary organization, these residents of 18th century rural England were resolute. The slaying on their doorstep would not go unanswered. They took off into the night, following the London to Portsmouth road in pursuit of the 3 fugitives. Meanwhile, Marshall, Casey, and Lone Gun hurried southward, eager to convert their spoils into money, but their downfall came quickly. A few hours after the attack, the trio stopped at another inn along the Portsmouth road and brazenly tried to sell the stolen clothing and belongings of their victim. As the 3 criminals haggled over the price of a sailor's jacket and pack, local authorities and the Thursley posse closed in. The Thursley posse bust in, and a scrap broke out between the 3 criminals and the armed men. Locals at the inn joined in and attacked the perpetrators, and by night's end, all 3 were under arrest and bound for jail. With the suspects in custody, the local authorities wasted no time in securing evidence. In an era before modern forensics, proof of guilt often relied on eyewitness testimony and the possession of stolen goods. In this case, the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses could place Marshall, Casey, and Lone Gun with the victim that day. Further, the bloodied clothing and belongings of the sailor were literally in their hands when they were captured. Yet beyond these tangible facts, the investigators resorted to a grim traditional custom to drive home the truth of the crime. On the journey to jail, the captors made a macabre detour. They brought the 3 accused back to a cottage where the corpse had been laid out and compelled each man to touch the lifeless body of the sailor. According to a persistent folk belief of the time, the wounds of a victim would bleed again in the presence of the true perpetrator. While this has sometimes been framed as a superstition-infused attempt to invoke divine justice, this wasn't the case in the 18th century. In the medieval period, there was a genuine belief in this method for proving guilt, but by this time it was essentially the Enlightenment era equivalent of a polygraph test. That is to say, it worked because a lot of people still superstitiously believed a corpse would bleed in the presence of the perpetrator. By forcing the men to press their hands hard against the freshly lifeless body of the unknown sailor, the authorities knew what would happen, and it worked. According to one account of what happened next, the three men were separated and introduced to the body separately, ostensibly to test who was actually involved in the slaying. The first two of the sailors pressed the lifeless body and had no reaction whatsoever. The third man ended up giving all them away. He pressed on the body, saw the blood, and broke down and confessed to what he and his comrades had done, sealing the fate of every man involved. Justice in the 18th century could move swiftly, and so it did for this case. The three defendants languished in jail through the winter of 1786, awaiting the next court to convene. On April 5, 1787, a brief trial was held for all the men, and the evidence against Marshall, Casey, and Longan was straightforward and damning. Multiple innkeepers and locals from along the Portsmouth Road testified to seeing the quartet together, and later seeing the suspects alone with the victim's goods. The stolen clothing, recovered from the men at the time of arrest, was presented as physical proof. Their final nail in the coffin, quite literally, was the confession of one of the men. With no credible defense to speak of, the jury needed little deliberation, and the three were sentenced to a public hanging, which was the style at the time. Unlike modern cases where condemned individuals sit around for decades working through the appeals process, the crowds wanted their entertainment. Just 2 days after the conviction, on April 7th, 1787, the sentence was carried out in dramatic fashion. Marshall, Casey, and Longan were transported back to Hindhead Hill under heavy guard. A massive crowd gathered from miles around to witness the event. As a quick aside, I wasn't joking when I said the people wanted their entertainment. Public hangings in the 18th century often attracted large crowds and had a carnival-like atmosphere, and it wasn't uncommon for vendors to sell food, drink, and trinkets at the event. Officially, in England, they were public spectacles meant to deter crime, and people would arrive early to get good viewing spots, especially for high-profile cases. If the case was high-profile enough, viewers could even get overpriced pamphlets describing the crimes committed as a dark memento of the event. Notably, the tacky circus-like atmosphere around these events eventually became an embarrassment, which led to the end of public hangings in the 19th century. The authorities pulled out all the stops for this event. At the very spot overlooking the Devil's Punch Bowl, where the unnamed sailor had met his end, a gallows had been erected for additional effect. The authorities also built an unusual three-armed gallows so that all three men could be hanged simultaneously, supposedly as a singular example of deterrence. Regardless of the intent, the three men dropped in unison to the cheers of raucous crowds. The bodies of Marshall, Casey, and Longan were then doused in tar and suspended in iron cages, where they were left to rot where they hung. For years after, travelers on the Portsmouth Road could gaze up at the ghastly sight of three skeletons dangling there as a warning to any who might contemplate such cruelty. While the perpetrators met a disgraceful end, the unknown sailor was treated with honor and compassion by the community he had briefly touched. Villagers recovered his remains and prepared a proper burial. Though no kin came forward to lay claim, the people of Thursley adopted the sailor as their own in death. They interred him in St. Michael's churchyard with all the rites befitting a local friend and compatriot. Then, in a remarkable gesture of collective empathy, locals took up a collection to erect a gravestone over the sailor's grave. That headstone, which still stands today, is a poignant and elaborate memorial. At its top is etched a depiction of the attack itself, three assailants attacking their victim, and below is an inscription written in verse. The epitaph tells the story of the unknown sailor who offered kindness and received only villainy in return. From the very beginning, the mystery of the victim's identity has loomed over this tale. The unknown sailor went to his grave without a name, but that hasn't stopped generations from wondering who he really was. Witnesses described him as being a younger man in his late 20s up to his mid-30s. He spoke of heading to Portsmouth to rejoin his ship, which implies he was on shore leave or had been visiting family or had business in London. These hints suggest he was potentially simply a serviceman returning to duty. For 2 centuries, there were effectively no clues that were publicly known until historian Peter Morey dug into family lore and newspaper archives. In a 2000 book, he highlighted a 1932 letter from Anne Macmillan to the local newspaper. She claimed the victim was her great-uncle, brother to Samuel Hardman of the 10th Light Dragoons. She recalled he came from a prosperous Lambeth family and left an unclaimed inheritance. Notably, the name of this uncle wasn't noted in the letter, but this allowed the web to be unraveled slightly. Morey then confirmed Samuel Hardman's existence in Lambeth and uncovered an Edward Hardman born there in 1752, who was Samuel's brother. Given that Edward would have been in his mid-30s, if Anne's letter was accurate, this would make him a strong candidate for the unknown sailor. Though no naval records explicitly name Edward, this theory offers the most convincing identity yet. Interestingly, we have a preserved gravesite for the unknown sailor, and given that we know the family he's supposedly connected to, this case could actually be solved. DNA analysis could either prove or disprove if the unknown sailor is related to this family. Further, it's possible that even if this doesn't work, genetic genealogy could be used to get a better sense of who he was. Notably, while England has stricter laws about this sort of thing, it's almost certain that someone from this man's family immigrated to America or Canada in the meantime. If so, their genetic information may be used to provide a clue as to who the unknown sailor is. From there, it would be possible to go through Royal Navy archives and determine if a potentially connected sailor failed to report back for duty. That said, of course, this is working under the assumption that there's a surviving muster roll, but it's a distinct possibility.